something I think about a lot is what's the right way to teach or enforce or regulate or apply values, right? At a macro level, at the aggregate level, across like a society or a country. What's the right way to do that? Because it's a tricky thing, right? I believe at our core, all the things we think about, the opinions we form, the views we hold, the actions we take, all of that stuff is usually rooted in some set of values that drives that. I talk about, math a lot and how we think and how we make decisions and all that. And I think that much like when you're doing, a math problem, to do it effectively, you need to know the rules of math, right? How does addition work? How does subtraction work? Multiplication, etc. There's certain rules that guide you to go forth and do the calculation correctly. I would argue that values are they function that way for us. They're the things that tell us how to do the calculations. They guide us through that, so that they're not just, blind inputs. So the problem though is, in math, there's a universal set of rules that we, by and large, all follow of how addition and subtraction work. At the value level, for us, individually, they all differ, right? Everybody has different values that have developed for different reasons. Something you learned from your parents, something you learned through experience. Maybe you had a traumatic experience that set something off, whatever it might be. Everybody has a different set of values. And that would be okay, right? Because it's a personal thing, and everybody, to each their own, they figure out how they want to function. But in a society, much like we are today, where it's so interconnected, those values matter, right? It's not just a personal thing. Your thoughts, your development of those values, the way you apply them to your thinking is yours, but the manifestation, the way it plays out, it's not, right? It's interconnected and it impacts other people. So that introduces this concept of people have, for lack of a better word, a right to have an opinion on your values, because it's going to impact them and it's going to impact other people. And once you introduce that, well, now it becomes this idea of there's right and there's wrong values, there's good and there's bad, or at the least there's better values than others, is how people start thinking about it. And then you start introducing all the flaws of the mind, and no surprise for some people, they feel like they've figured it out and they have the right values and this is the right way to look at the world, and everybody needs to look at it this way. But it's tricky because, even if you try and bring it down to its base level of like, well, can't we all agree on something? Isn't there some base level of value we can agree on? And you start thinking of some of the things, right? Like, well, just do no harm, right? Don't hurt other people. As long as you're not hurting other people, I think we're in good shape. But then it's like, well, don't hurt them, but unless they deserve it, right? Unless something's happening, unless they're trying to hurt somebody else, right? Or they're trying to hurt you, well, then maybe you can hurt them. Well, now the subjectivity comes in, right? Well, how do you define they're trying to hurt somebody else? Does it have to be physical? And does it have to be like they're in the act of doing it? Or I just know that they might do it? What if they're just hurting them in some mental, psychological way? What if they're hurting them in some long-term plan that might take 10 years to actually develop, but I think it's going to happen? Like, it's all very subjective, so that doesn't work, right? Same concept, right? No violence. Just don't do. No violence is never the answer. Again, well, unless they're doing something violent or unless it's needed because the situation calls for it, right? You see that today with the riots and the protests and things, depending on where you sit on it. But there's an argument to be made that some people would say is like, hey, sometimes you need that, right? You can even go back to the Boston Tea Party and, back in our revolutionary days. Sometimes violence we're okay with, so that doesn't really work, right? And then we'll just teach, treat everybody the way you want to be treated. That seems, right, the golden rule. That seems like that would be the one that hits it. But what if you don't even really know how you want to be treated? Or worse yet, you're not self-aware enough and aware in general enough to even understand what that really means, right? Because think of it again in today's terms. Let's say you're a white male and you say, hey, I just treat everybody the way I want to be treated, right? So if everybody treat me the way, like, let's all just do that. And in your mind, you're like, I see everybody as equal, no problems here, but everybody should see me as an equal and there should be no consideration of race. But that doesn't account for the fact that perhaps, even if that's true, and you may not even be being honest with yourself, but let's assume it is, society might not function in that way. Other people may not function in that way. Again, right, that interconnectedness. So now you might have minorities or people of color who are saying like, hey, things need to change. Now this white person is saying, well, why would it change? Just treat me the way I want to treat you. I'm treating you fine. Why would you question me or call me out for my race or want to, take my favorite movie off HBO or whatever it is? It becomes interconnected. So even that, treat me the way treat you the way I want to be treated, that becomes problematic. And you can kind of go down the list, and there's not a clean way to do this. There's not a clean way, there's not a base level. And it makes you realize, and in some ways appreciate, regardless if you believe or not, the value of religion. Because if for nothing else, it's a way to coordinate values across a large group of people. Because when people are dictating values and people are trying to regulate and enforce, etc., that's problematic for the reasons we're talking about. But if God says it, if God says this is the way you should act, these are the values you should have, well, that's a much easier pill to swallow. And now you're not infighting among yourselves because there's some higher power that's dictating it. So you can understand why religion has been so powerful, it's been so important, and maybe in some ways has been beneficial for societies. Now, most people would agree that, particularly in America and the Western world, religion's becoming less important. Less people believe in God or at least actively participate in it. And there's some, theories around that's leading to some of the problems we have today. And it may very well be true. But, you get back to this point of what's the right way to enforce or regulate values, right? If you're somebody who believes, and values, there's the deep base values like we talked about, do no harm, those types of things, but they start to manifest out into values about specific situations, right? Should you wear a mask? Should you not wear a mask because of coronavirus? And for somebody, their values dictate that, hey, if there's a chance it might help somebody, then you wear the mask. Whereas somebody else might say, hey, personal freedom, free will, liberty, those are core values. And somebody's not going to tell me what I have to do or what I have to wear, right? Different values, fine on their own, but in an interconnected society, they become problematic. Well, what do you do, right? If you're that person on the right who says, liberties is all it's about, and I'm not going to do it, right? I'm going to handle it my way, and nobody should have to wear a mask. Well, now potentially you're putting other people at risk because of your values, right? And you believe you know better, you believe you're in a better position. But how do you enforce that, right? Because as soon as you start regulating or trying to control other people's values, it seems to be a losing proposition, because again, it introduces a subjectivity that you know better, that you have the answer that they don't have. And again, even the idea that there is a right answer here, that there's an objectively right answer when it comes to these values. So what's the answer, right? What's the solution? To me, it would seem as though the best solution is a free market type solution, right? Free market meaning you let people hold whatever values they want to hold. You don't try to control them. You don't try and regulate them or change them in any way. You let each person develop their own values personal to them and let them play out as such. And you let the free market dictate it, right? You could take all different examples, but let's pick one. We've talked about it recently. Somebody's protesting. Somebody says something. Drew Brees says something about people protesting during the national anthem and that he disagrees with it. You have some people who might say, hey, he needs to be canceled, right? He needs to be eliminated. And they'll ask, his football team to cut him, or they'll ask his sponsors to cut him. If the free market plays out that way, if those sponsors decide and they do their calculations and they think about their values and they say these no longer align with what he said, doesn't align with our values anymore, and they decide to drop Drew Brees as a sponsor or cut him from the team, whatever, that's their decision, and they can do that, and nobody should be mad about that. Nobody should be angry, because the same free market will kick in for that sponsor, right? If that sponsor makes that decision and enough people say, hey, I don't like that decision that you made, I don't think you should have done that to Drew Brees, well, then they'll stop buying their stuff and stop supporting that company. And again, there's consequences to everything you do. That's the idea of the free market, right? Let it just play out naturally the way that it should. Don't feel like you need to bring in some sort of regulation and control it. And I get the temptation, right? And this gets back to what we always talk to. there's people that feel like for various reasons they know better and they know what the right answer is and what should happen. But as we talked about throughout this video, it's a losing proposition. You have to let it play out on its own. If somebody's a racist, if somebody's a bigot, if somebody's gluttonous, if somebody's mean-spirited, whatever it might be, you let that play out, and the consequences should catch up with that person. The free market should correct for that person, and it shouldn't be allowed to go on. And you kind of let that play out as such. Now, I get the counter argument to it potentially, or I could predict it. The free market doesn't work, right? You take a situation like racism, and people would say, yeah, that's great if when people were racist, the free market stopped them. But historically, there's been lots of racist people, and they've thrived and done really well. And that's true. That's a true statement. And, what do you do about that? Well, you get back to the point of, well, you have to regulate it, right? Obviously, people aren't getting their values right to begin with. They believe racism is okay, or they don't believe this is a problem. And this is really the crux of the issue, and kind of where I'll close the video without a solid answer. So what's the answer, right, to that? Well, okay, so then we need to force them. They don't see it. They don't understand why this is so important. But again, you get back to that losing proposition then. As soon as you're forcing your views on somebody else, you're going to force them to say, you have to act this way. Even if you believe something as seemingly simple as racism is bad, and you're going to try and force that onto people, that you need to understand it's bad. One, it doesn't account for the complexity of it. What is racism? How do we define it? Is it all bad, or is some of it natural, right? To something like that. But even if it's just the bad type, how do you force that on somebody? How do you force them to accept that these are the values? I come back to the free market, right? If enough people believe that that is bad, it will force itself onto it. So what does that say about America for a few hundred years? That we didn't see any issue with that. Well, maybe we were a bad society. And maybe there's some other way the free market should have corrected that or fixed that. Whatever that might be. Maybe more people should have left the country, right? Maybe this blind faith we had to the country that we're America and we got to fix it, that wasn't the answer. The free market didn't play out the way it should. If more people left the country and said, hey, we're going somewhere else, we're doing something different, maybe that fixes it. It just seems like you control what you can control. You let the free market play out based on each person making their individual decision, and that's really the best you can hope for. I fully reserve the right to be wrong on this. Perhaps in thinking about it deeper, there is a reason in which you can't just trust the free market. And somebody does have to make that decision, but then who's that somebody? And what happens when that somebody's gone and somebody else steps in and they see things slightly differently? It's a complex, complicated topic without an easy answer.